Some stories are so impossible that most people dismiss them as fiction. But if you're someone who believes that miracles are documented reality, not fairy tales, then what I'm about to share will change everything you think you know about the power of pure love. It was 2:47 a.m. on a freezing December night in Denver, Colorado, when Daniel Morrison made a decision that would either save his life or prove he had completely lost his mind. Standing outside a 7-Eleven with exactly $3.17 to his name, this 42-year-old homeless Army veteran was staring at two choices: buy himself one last meal, or spend his final money on cat food for a mysterious orange tabby that had been following him for days. Daniel chose the cat. What happened next triggered the most documented manifestation miracle of 2024. Security cameras, bank records, medical files, and dozens of witnesses captured every impossible twist in Daniel's transformation from sleeping in doorways to becoming a multi-millionaire philanthropist. The orange cat wasn't just any stray animal. Its behavior was so unusual, so precisely timed, that veterinarians who later examined it couldn't explain how it seemed to predict Daniel's needs before Daniel even knew what they were. Every single time Daniel gave away food he desperately needed, every moment he chose the cat's welfare over his own survival, something miraculous happened within hours. I'm talking about documented miracles, not feel-good coincidences, but events so statistically impossible that mathematicians who reviewed the case called it a 1,000,000,000-to-1 sequence of favorable outcomes. This is the kind of impossible story that changes everything you believe about reality. If you're someone who knows there's more to life than what we can see, you're going to want to follow this journey with me as I share the documented miracles that mainstream media refuses to touch. Because what happened to Daniel challenges everything we've been taught about manifestation. And by the end of this account, you'll either believe in the power of unconditional love or question everything you thought you knew about how the universe really works. But I need to warn you, what you're about to hear isn't just a feel-good story. It's about the invisible laws that govern abundance and what happens when someone with nothing left to give keeps giving anyway. And as you're about to discover, but miracles haven't stopped. They've multiplied in ways that are transforming thousands of lives. Daniel Morrison had been awake for 36 hours straight, and the voices in his head were getting louder. Not the kind of voices that indicated psychosis, though he'd wondered about that too, but the relentless chorus of self-doubt, shame, and survival calculations that had become the soundtrack of his life since returning from Afghanistan 3 years ago with PTSD so severe that holding down a job had become impossible. The temperature had dropped to 14 degrees, and Daniel could see his breath forming crystalline clouds in the amber glow of the 7-Eleven's fluorescent lights. His armor-shoed sleeping bag, the one piece of gear he'd managed to keep through 3 evictions and countless nights in shelters, doorways, and abandoned buildings, was soaked through from the previous night's sleet. His feet had gone numb hours ago, a dangerous sign he recognized from his military training, but finding warm, dry shelter with $3.17 was like trying to perform surgery with a butter knife. He pressed his face against the store's glass door, feeling the heat radiating from inside, and counted his money again. 3 crumpled dollar bills and 17 cents in change that clinked together in his frozen fingers like tiny wind chimes. Enough for a gas station burrito that would give him maybe 6 hours of energy, or a small bag of chips and a candy bar that might last until morning. His stomach had been empty for so long that the hunger pangs had evolved into a constant, gnawing presence he'd named Harold because giving it a name somehow made the pain feel less personal. That's when he heard the soft meowing. Daniel turned toward the sound and saw the orange tabby cat sitting perfectly still beside the newspaper stand, its bright amber eyes fixed directly on him. This wasn't the first time he'd seen this particular cat. For the past 4 days, it appeared at the strangest moments outside the library, where he'd been trying to stay warm, near the dumpster behind McDonald's where he'd been searching for edible scraps, always watching him with an intensity that felt almost human. The cat was thin, its orange fur matted and dull, but there was something about its posture, the way it held its head, that suggested dignity despite its circumstances. It reminded Daniel of the stray dogs he'd encountered during his deployment in Kandahar and Amos that had somehow maintained their spirit despite living in a war zone. "Hey there, buddy," Daniel whispered, his voice cracking from dehydration. "You picking through the trash too?" The cat didn't move, didn't even blink. It just sat there, perfectly still, as if waiting for something. Daniel noticed a small puddle of frozen water near the cat's paws, and suddenly he understood. The animal was thirsty, hungry, just like him. Daniel looked at his $3 again, then at the cat, then back at his money. The rational part of his brain, the part that had kept him alive through 12 months in a combat zone, screamed that he couldn't afford to feed anyone but himself. He was already dangerously malnourished. His ribs were visible through his thin jacket, and he'd started having dizzy spells that lasted for minutes at a time. But something deeper, something that felt like a voice from another lifetime, when he'd been the kind of man who helped wounded soldiers regardless of the risk to himself, whispered a different message. What if this moment matters more than you know? Daniel walked into the 7-Eleven, the sudden blast of warm air making his cheeks sting. The night clerk, a young man with tired eyes and a name tag that read Marcus, looked up from his phone and nodded. Daniel had been in here enough times that Marcus knew he wasn't a threat, just another invisible casualty of circumstances trying to survive another night. The cat food was in aisle 3, small cans stacked neatly between the baby formula and the energy drinks. Daniel picked up a can of Friskies, turkey and giblets, checked the price 99 cents and did the math. If he bought cat food, he'd have $2.18 left. Enough for a small bag of peanuts and maybe a candy bar. Not enough for anything that would actually sustain him through the night. He stood there for what felt like hours, holding the can of cat food in his trembling hands. This was insane. He was literally starving, and he was considering spending 30% of his remaining money on an animal that wasn't even his pet. The smart thing, the survival thing, was to buy himself food and ignore the cat. Animals were resourceful. It would find something. But as Daniel stood in that fluorescent-lit aisle, something shifted in his chest. Maybe it was the memory of feeding stray dogs in Afghanistan. Or maybe it was the recognition of another living thing in desperate circumstances. But suddenly, the choice became clear in a way that bypassed logic entirely. He grabbed a second can of cat food. At the counter, Marcus rang up the 2 cans without comment. $2.08, he said quietly. Daniel handed over his $3 and took the 10 cents in change, leaving him with exactly 27 cents to his name. As he walked back outside into the bitter cold, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Not relief, not satisfaction, but a deep, inexplicable sense that he had just made the right choice. Even though every rational indicator suggested the opposite. The orange cat was exactly where he'd left it, sitting beside the newspaper stand as if it had never moved. Daniel opened the first can with the pull tab, the metallic smell of processed meat making his own stomach clench with hunger. He set the can down about 3 feet from the cat and stepped back. "There you go, buddy. Dinner's served." The cat approached slowly, cautiously, but with a purposefulness that suggested intelligence beyond typical feline behavior. As it began to eat, Daniel opened the second can and set it down nearby. The cat looked up at him, and for just a moment, Daniel could have sworn he saw something like gratitude in those amber eyes. Daniel settled down against the brick wall of the store, pulling his damp sleeping bag around his shoulders. He had 27 cents, no food, and nowhere to sleep. But watching the orange cat eat with obvious appreciation, he felt something he'd almost forgotten existed. The satisfaction of putting someone else's needs before his own. That's when his phone buzzed with a text message from a number he didn't recognize. At 3:17 a.m., in 14-degree weather, with no explanation of how anyone had gotten his number, someone had sent him a message that would change everything. The kindness you just showed will return to you tenfold. This is only the beginning. If you're still with me at this point. It means you're exactly the kind of person who understands that reality is far more magical than we've been taught. There's a growing community of us here who recognize that these aren't coincidences, they're miracles. Subscribe to this channel because what happens next in Daniel's story is going to challenge everything you thought you knew about manifestation. And trust me, you don't want to miss a single detail of how this impossible transformation unfolds. Daniel stared at his phone screen until the text disappeared, convinced his malnourished brain was playing tricks on him. The number showed as disconnected when he tried to call back. The message had no timestamp, no delivery confirmation, nothing that proved it had actually existed, except the memory burning in his mind like a brand. He didn't sleep that night, partly because sleeping outdoors in 14-degree weather was essentially choosing hypothermia, but mostly because every time he closed his eyes, he saw those amber eyes of the orange cat looking at him with what felt like ancient wisdom. By dawn, his teeth were chattering so violently that he bit his tongue twice, and the metallic taste of blood mixed with the persistent ache of hunger to create a sensory experience he would remember for the rest of his life. At 6:47 a.m., as pale winter sunlight began creeping across the empty parking lot, the cat reappeared. Not gradually, not slinking from some hiding place, but suddenly present, sitting in the exact same spot beside the newspaper stand as if it had materialized from thin air. "Morning, buddy," Daniel croaked, his voice barely audible through his chattering teeth. "Sleep better than I did, I hope." The cat meowed once, a sound that seemed to carry more meaning than most human conversations Daniel had experienced lately, and began walking toward the street. After about 10 steps, it stopped and looked back at Daniel with unmistakable expectation. Every survival instinct Daniel had developed on the streets screamed at him to stay put, to conserve energy, to focus on finding food or shelter before he collapsed from exhaustion. Following a cat with 27 cents in his pocket was the kind of decision that could literally kill him. But something deeper than instinct, something that felt like faith operating on a frequency he hadn't accessed since childhood prayers, told him to follow. The cat led him 6 blocks through downtown Denver, past closed shops and empty office buildings, moving with purpose through streets Daniel had never explored. It would walk 20 or 30 steps, then pause to ensure Daniel was following, its tail held high like an orange flag against the gray morning sky. They stopped in front of First National Bank, where a well-dressed woman in her 50s was fumbling with her purse while talking rapidly on her phone. "I know it's here somewhere," she was saying, her voice tight with frustration. "I had it when I left Starbucks. I'm sure of it." That's when Daniel saw the wallet lying half-hidden under a pile of snow. Beside the bank's ATM, the leather was expensive-looking, brown with gold clasps. The kind of wallet that probably cost more than Daniel had owned in total possessions for the past 6 months. He picked it up with trembling fingers and brushed off the snow. The woman was still searching her purse, still talking on her phone, completely unaware that her wallet was 3 feet away. Daniel could have walked away. The rational part of his brain calculated that this wallet probably contained enough cash to feed him for weeks, maybe enough to get him into a cheap motel for a few nights. No one had seen him find it. The woman would report it stolen. The bank would review security footage. But by then, Daniel could be long gone. Instead, he walked over and tapped her gently on the shoulder. "Excuse me, ma'am, I think this is yours." The woman turned, saw Daniel's disheveled appearance, and instinctively stepped backward. Daniel recognized the look, the automatic fear response people had when confronted with visible homelessness. He'd seen it so many times that it no longer stung, just added to the weight of invisibility he carried everywhere. "I found your wallet by the ATM," Daniel said quietly, holding it out to her. The woman's expression changed instantly from fear to shock to something approaching wonder. "Oh my God," she breathed, taking the wallet with hands that shook almost as much as Daniel's. "I've been looking everywhere. I thought someone had stolen it from the coffee shop." She opened the wallet and Daniel caught a glimpse of the contents. At least $400 in cash, credit cards, family photos, business cards. Enough to change his life, at least temporarily. "I can't believe," She started, then looked at Daniel more closely, really seeing him for the first time. She noticed his torn jacket, his hollow cheeks, the way he swayed slightly on his feet from exhaustion. "When did you last eat?" she asked suddenly. "Yesterday," Daniel lied. It had been 3 days. Without another word, the woman pulled out 8 $50 bills and pressed them into Daniel's hands. "Please," she said, when he tried to refuse. "You could have taken everything and been gone. Instead, you returned it. That kind of honesty." She shook her head. "It's rare. Take this, please. $400. Daniel stared at the money in his hands, feeling the crisp texture of the bills, smelling the faint scent of the woman's perfume that clung to them. More money than he'd held in over a year. "Thank you," was all he managed to whisper. "No," the woman said firmly. "Thank you. You've restored my faith in humanity today." As she walked away, Daniel looked around for the orange cat. It was sitting perfectly still beside a fire hydrant, watching the entire exchange with those intelligent amber eyes. When Daniel approached, the cat stood up, meowed once, and began walking in a new direction. Daniel followed, his mind reeling. 8 hours ago, he'd had $3.17. He'd spent most of that on cat food for an animal he'd never seen before, leaving himself with nothing. Now he had $400 and the overwhelming sense that he'd just experienced something far beyond coincidence. The cat led him to a small diner called Betty's Kitchen, where the early morning shift was just starting. Through the window, Daniel could see waitresses setting up tables and a cook firing up the grill. The smells drifting from the exhaust fan made his empty stomach contract with desperate longing. But more than the prospect of food, what struck Daniel was the feeling that every step of this morning had been orchestrated by something far more intelligent than random chance. The timing of finding the wallet, the woman's grateful generosity, the cat's unerring guidance to places Daniel needed to beat felt like being inside a story that was writing itself. As he pushed open the diner door, the orange cat settled down beside the entrance as if taking up a guard post. Daniel had no idea that this was only the first of 17 documented miracles that would occur over the next 43 days. Each one triggered by his choice to put compassion before self-preservation. But he was about to find out that when you choose love over fear, the universe responds in ways that redefine everything you thought possible. 2 weeks later, Daniel had documented 17 separate incidents of what he'd started calling cat miracles, in a notebook he'd bought with some of his unexpected windfall. Each entry followed the same impossible pattern. The orange cat would appear, lead him somewhere specific, and within hours, something extraordinary would happen that directly addressed his immediate needs. Day 3. The cat led him to a construction site where a worker had accidentally dropped his lunch. When Daniel returned it, the grateful contractor offered him 3 days of cash under work that earned him enough for a week in a cheap motel. Day 7. Following the cat to a bookstore, Daniel found a help-wanted sign in the window that hadn't been there an hour earlier. The owner, impressed by Daniel's military background, hired him for part-time inventory work. Day 12. The cat guided him to a coffee shop where he overheard a woman crying about her missing emotional support animal. Daniel spent 4 hours helping her search and find her lost dog. She insisted on paying him $200 and gave him contact information for a veterans counseling group that would change his life. But it was day 18 that shattered Daniel's last grip on rational explanations. The cat appeared outside his motel room at exactly 7:30 a.m., which had become their routine meeting time. Daniel had started buying high-quality cat food and even got the animal a small collar with a tag that read, "Prophet," a name that had come to him in a dream. He'd tried multiple times to bring Prophet inside, but the cat always declined, preferring to maintain its independence while clearly claiming Daniel as its chosen human. This morning, Prophet led him through downtown Denver to an upscale coffee shop called the Daily Grind in the Arts District. Daniel had never been inside a place this expensive. Marble counters, hanging plants, customers typing on MacBooks while sipping $12 lattes. He felt profoundly out of place despite his recent improvements in circumstances and hygiene. Prophet walked directly to a bookshelf near the back of the shop and began pawing at a particular volume. Daniel approached cautiously, aware that other patrons were starting to notice the unusual behavior of this orange cat that had somehow gotten inside an establishment that definitely didn't allow pets. The book was a worn copy of The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle. As Daniel pulled it from the shelf, a handwritten note fell out and landed at his feet. His hands shook as he picked up the folded piece of paper and read the words that would change everything. The person reading this has been chosen. Your kindness to Prophet has been observed and documented. If you are willing to participate in a test of character that will determine your worthiness for an extraordinary inheritance, meet me at Civic Center Park tomorrow at 3 p.m. Bring proof of your compassion toward animals. This offer expires in 24 hours and will never be repeated. Come alone. Daniel read the note 3 times, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his temples. He looked around the coffee shop frantically, searching for whoever might have planted this message. But everyone was absorbed in their own activities. He approached the barista, a young woman with purple hair and multiple piercings. "Excuse me," Daniel said, holding up the book. "Do you know who put this note in here?" The barista looked at the note, then at Daniel, her expression shifting from mild interest to visible confusion. "Sir, we don't put notes in our books. Customers aren't supposed to write in them or leave things inside them. But someone had to put it here," Daniel insisted. "My cat led me directly to this book. Someone wanted me to find this." The barista's confusion deepened. "Your cat, sir. We don't allow animals in here. I would have noticed if someone came in with a cat." Daniel turned to point at Prophet, but the orange tabby had vanished. Not slipped away, not hidden behind furniture, simply gone, as if it had never been there at all. For the next 24 hours, Daniel couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on anything except the note and its impossible implications. He researched Civic Center Park obsessively, looking for any clues about what this test might involve or who might be behind it. The rational part of his mind insisted this was elaborate fraud, a setup for robbery or worse. But something deeper, something that had learned to trust the impossible chain of miracles that had defined his recent weeks, told him this was real. At 2:45 p.m. the next day, Daniel sat on a bench in Civic Center Park with a manila envelope containing every photo he'd taken of himself feeding and caring for Prophet, plus documentation of the money he'd spent on cat food, veterinary care, and the collar. His hands wouldn't stop trembling, and he'd changed clothes 3 times, trying to strike a balance between respectful and authentic. At exactly 3 p.m., a woman approached him. She was perhaps 70 years old, elegantly dressed in a way that suggested significant wealth, but her eyes held a kindness that immediately put Daniel at ease. Most remarkably, she was carrying a small orange tabby cat that looked exactly like Prophet. "Daniel Morrison," she said, settling beside him on the bench. "I'm Margaret Whitfield, and this is Prophet. I believe you two have already met." Daniel stared at the cat in her arms, recognition flooding through him like electricity. Same amber eyes, same distinctive markings, same intelligent expression that had guided him through 2 weeks of miracles. "I don't understand," Daniel managed. "Prophet isn't your cat. He's been living on the streets, following me around, leading me too." Margaret smiled, an expression that contained decades of secrets. "Prophet has never lived on the streets, Daniel. He lives in a mansion in Cherry Hills Village with heated floors, gourmet meals, and a full-time veterinary staff. Every morning for the past 3 weeks, I've driven him downtown and released him to find you. Every evening, he returns home to report on your activities." The world tilted sideways. Daniel gripped the bench so hard his knuckles went white. That's impossible. Cats don't work that way. They don't follow commands or conduct surveillance. Prophet isn't an ordinary cat, Margaret said gently. He was specially trained by my late husband, Dr. Richard Whitfield, as part of the most elaborate character assessment ever designed. For 23 years, Prophet has been searching for someone who would consistently choose compassion over self-preservation, who would give away their last resources to help an animal in need, even when they themselves were desperate. She reached into her purse and pulled out a thick legal document. You are the first person in over 2 decades to pass Richard's test. Daniel Morrison, if you're willing to accept the responsibility that comes with it. You are about to inherit $2.7 million and the mission to use that fortune to help other veterans who find themselves in the circumstances you've just escaped. Daniel looked at the legal papers, at Margaret's kind face, at Prophet purring contentedly in her arms, and realized that his choice to spend his last $3 on cat food hadn't just saved his life. It had changed everything. Margaret Whitfield's mansion in Cherry Hills Village felt like stepping into a different universe. Daniel had spent the past hour signing legal documents that transferred more money than he'd ever imagined into his name. But his attention kept drifting to the framed photographs covering every surface pictures of Dr. Richard Whitfield with various animals. All of them wearing the same intelligent expression Daniel had grown to recognize in Prophet's amber eyes. Richard was a behavioral psychologist who specialized in animal intelligence. Margaret explained, settling into a leather armchair that probably cost more than most people's cars. Prophet immediately jumped into her lap, purring with the satisfaction of a job well completed. But his real passion was studying human compassion. He believed that a person's treatment of animals when they themselves are suffering reveals the truest measure of their character. Daniel sat carefully on the edge of an antique sofa, afraid to fully relax into luxury he didn't feel he'd earned. But why me? Why not someone who actually deserves this kind of fortune? Margaret's eyes softened with something that looked like maternal pride. Daniel, do you have any idea how rare what you did actually is? We have 23 years of documentation. Prophet has approached over 4,000 people in desperate circumstances. Homeless individuals, people going through divorces, job losses, medical bankruptcies, addiction recovery. Do you know how many chose to help him when they could barely help themselves? Daniel shook his head, not trusting his voice. 7. In 23 years, only 7 people made the choice you made consistently. And of those 7, you're the only one who maintained that choice even when it meant genuine sacrifice. The others helped Prophet once or twice, then stopped when their own situations improved. Margaret stood and walked to a massive oak desk, returning with a thick folder marked Daniel Morrison's subject assessment. Daniel's stomach clenched as he realized he'd been under surveillance for far longer than he'd imagined. We've been watching you for 8 months, Margaret continued, opening the folder to reveal photographs, medical records, and detailed behavioral notes. Richard's instructions were specific. Identify veterans with severe PTSD who had lost everything through no fault of their own. Then monitor their behavior during their darkest periods. The test only began when subjects had reached absolute rock bottom, when helping others would require genuine self-sacrifice. She pulled out a photograph of Daniel sleeping in a doorway, sharing his jacket with Prophet on a night when the temperature had dropped below 0. This picture was taken on December 3rd. According to our veterinary assessment, you had given Prophet so much of your own food that you were showing signs of dangerous malnutrition. Your body temperature was low enough to indicate hypothermia, yet you still ensured Prophet stayed warm. Daniel remembered that night the way his ribs ached with hunger, the dizzy spells that made walking dangerous, the moment he'd wrapped Prophet in his jacket, knowing it might kill him. I couldn't let him freeze, he whispered. Richard believed that moment when someone has nothing left but still reveals the soul's true nature. He called it the Prophet test because it required prophetic faith that generosity would somehow be rewarded, even when all evidence suggested the opposite. Margaret turned to another section of the file. Your military records show consistent patterns of the same behavior. In Kandahar, you gave your food rations to local children 14 documented times. Even when supply runs were delayed and you faced genuine starvation, you carried wounded soldiers to safety during firefights when the tactically sound decision would have been to leave them. Your psychological evaluation noted pathological altruism, the tendency to help others even at significant personal cost. The phrase hit Daniel like a physical blow. He'd never heard his behavior described in medical terms, but somehow it felt accurate. The doctor said it was part of my PTSD, survivor guilt expressing itself as compulsive helping. The doctors were wrong, Margaret said firmly. Richard's research proved that true altruism, the kind that persists even during personal crises, is incredibly rare and entirely separate from psychological disorder. What you have isn't pathological. It's exactly the character trait Richard spent his entire career trying to find and reward. She pulled out the final section of the file: bank records, transaction histories, and detailed documentation of every miracle Daniel had experienced over the past 3 weeks. We tracked every dollar that came into your life after you started helping Prophet. The woman whose wallet you returned, the contractor who hired you, the dog owner who paid you for finding her petal of it was genuine. Daniel, we didn't orchestrate any of those encounters. We simply observed what happened when someone with your character began operating from a place of faith instead of fear. Daniel stared at the documentation, his mind struggling to process the magnitude of what he was seeing. You're saying the miracles were real? That helping Prophet actually caused good things to happen? Richard believed that compassion creates energetic patterns that attract positive outcomes, Margaret explained. Not mystical nonsense, but observable behavioral patterns. When you consistently choose to help others, you unconsciously signal to the world that you're trustworthy, that you operate from abundance rather than scarcity. People respond to that energy and create opportunities they wouldn't offer to someone operating from desperation or selfishness. She closed the folder and looked directly at Daniel with an intensity that reminded him of Prophet's unwavering gaze. But here's what Richard discovered in his decades of research. This pattern only works for people who help others without expectation of reward. The moment someone starts being kind because they expect it to return to them, the magic stops. What made you different, Daniel, is that you helped Prophet even when you were convinced it would kill you. That's the rarest human quality in existence. Margaret stood and walked to the window overlooking her perfectly manicured gardens. Richard died 3 years ago, but his will was very specific. The $2.7 million was to go to the first person who passed the Prophet test, completely who would feed a stray animal their last meal, protect it from danger at personal risk, and continue that compassion even when their own survival was at stake. That person would then be tasked with using the fortune to replicate Richard's work on a larger scale. She turned back to Daniel, her expression combining challenge with hope. Richard believed that identifying and supporting people with your character could change the world. The money comes with a mission, Daniel. You're not inheriting a fortune. You're inheriting a responsibility to find others like yourself and give them the resources to transform their communities through compassion. Daniel looked at Prophet, who had been watching this entire conversation with those impossibly intelligent eyes, and realized that his decision to buy cat food with his last $3 hadn't just changed his life. It had apparently chosen him to change others. 18 months later, Daniel Morrison stood in the main hall of the Prophet Foundation headquarters, watching dozens of formerly homeless veterans prepare for another day of outreach work. The building itself was a testament to what happens when unlimited compassion meets unlimited resources. A converted warehouse in downtown Denver that now housed the largest veteran rehabilitation center in Colorado, complete with medical facilities, job training programs, and long-term housing options. But the real miracle wasn't the building or the programs. It was what happened to every single person who came through their doors. Tell me about Marcus, Daniel said to Dr. Sarah Chen, the Foundation's Director of Psychological Services. As they watched a young veteran teaching computer skills to a group of older homeless men. Marcus Rodriguez, 34 Marines, Sarah replied, consulting her tablet. Arrived here 6 months ago with severe PTSD, addiction issues, and hadn't spoken to his family in 3 years. Within 2 weeks of starting our animal therapy program with Prophet's offspring, he experienced what can only be described as miraculous recovery acceleration. Daniel nodded, familiar with the pattern. The synchronicities started immediately. Day 12, Sarah confirmed. His estranged daughter called out of nowhere just as he was working with Prophet's son, Spirit, to comfort a new arrival having a panic attack. Then his old Marine buddy happened to be in Denver and saw Marcus through the window. Now, Marcus has a full-time job, his own apartment, and he's getting married next month to a woman he met while volunteering at the animal shelter. This was the phenomenon that had made the Prophet Foundation famous in psychology circles and brought researchers from around the world to study what they were calling the Morrison effect. Every veteran who committed to helping others, particularly through animal care, experienced rapid positive life changes that defied statistical probability. Daniel walked through the facility, Prophet padding silently beside him as he'd done every day for the past 18 months. At 72 years old, the orange tabby showed no signs of slowing down, and his ability to identify people in genuine need had only grown more precise. More remarkably, Prophet's 3 offspring, Spirit, Grace, and Mercy, had inherited their father's unusual talents and now worked alongside trained therapists throughout the foundation. "Daniel, you need to see this," called Rebecca Torres, the foundation's research coordinator, from her office overlooking the main therapy room. Daniel found her staring at a computer screen displaying statistical analyses that made his head spin. "We just completed the 18-month outcome study," Rebecca said, barely containing her excitement. "We've served 847 veterans through our programs. Of those, 804 have achieved stable housing, employment, and significant improvement in psychological wellness metrics. That's a 95% success rate. Daniel, the national average for veteran homeless programs is 31%. Daniel studied the numbers, still struggling to believe what they represented. And the synchronicity reports? Even more remarkable. 89% of our program participants report positive life changes within 30 days that they describe as miraculous or impossible coincidences. Job opportunities appearing out of nowhere, family relationships healing, unexpected financial windfalls, meeting future spouses under improbable circumstances. The pattern is so consistent that Harvard Medical School wants to fund a 10-year longitudinal study. But what the statistics couldn't capture was the transformation Daniel witnessed daily. Veterans who arrived broken and hopeless discovered that helping others, feeding stray animals, volunteering at senior centers, mentoring at-risk youth somehow triggered cascades of positive changes in their own lives. It wasn't therapy or medication or job training, though the foundation provided all of those. It was the simple act of choosing compassion over self-preservation, even in small ways, that seemed to activate some universal law of abundance. "Mr. Morrison," a soft voice interrupted his thoughts. Daniel turned to see Angela Hoffman, a 42-year-old Navy veteran who'd arrived 3 weeks earlier after losing her housing due to medical bankruptcy. "I wanted to thank you before I leave for my new job interview." Daniel smiled, recognizing another success story in progress. "How did the interview opportunity come up?" Angela's face lit up with wonder. "It's the strangest thing. I was volunteering at the animal shelter yesterday, helping socialize rescue dogs. When this woman started talking to me about her company's need for someone with logistics experience, turns out she's the CEO of a veteran-owned supply chain company, and they've been looking for someone with exactly my background for 6 months. She offered me the interview on the spot." This was the pattern Daniel had learned to expect, but never stopped marveling at. Once people began consistently choosing to help others, opportunities appeared in their lives with timing so perfect it seemed orchestrated by an invisible intelligence. "Angela," Daniel said gently, "when you get this job, and you will get this job, remember that your success comes with responsibility. The abundance you're about to experience isn't random luck. It's the universe responding to your choice to put service before self-interest. Use your good fortune to help others make the same choice." As Angela walked away, practically glowing with hope and purpose, Prophet meowed softly and looked up at Daniel with those amber eyes that had started everything. The cat's expression seemed to say, "This is how it's supposed to work." Margaret Whitfield's voice echoed in Daniel's memory from their conversation the day before. "Richard would be amazed by what you've accomplished. In 18 months, you've proven his theory on a scale he never imagined possible. You've created a system that doesn't just help individual veterans. You've demonstrated that compassion is contagious and abundance is renewable." But Daniel knew the real miracle wasn't the success statistics or the research validation, or even the millions of dollars flowing through the foundation. The real miracle was the moment each person discovered what he'd learned on a freezing December night outside a 7-Eleven. When you choose love over fear, when you give, even when you have nothing left to give, the universe responds with generosity that defies every law of scarcity. Prophet's offspring were now working in veteran centers across 7 states, each one guided by the same mysterious intelligence that had led Daniel to his transformation. The miracles were multiplying, creating ripple effects of compassion and abundance that touched thousands of lives and showed no signs of slowing down. As Daniel locked up the foundation building that evening, Prophet sitting regally in the passenger seat of his modest Honda Civic, he'd kept his lifestyle simple despite his fortune. He reflected on the phone call that had changed everything just hours earlier. "Mr. Morrison," the voice had said, "this is Colonel Patricia Hayes from the Department of Veterans Affairs. We've been studying your foundation's outcomes for the past year, and we'd like to discuss implementing the Prophet model in veteran centers nationwide. We're talking about scaling your approach to potentially help hundreds of thousands of veterans." Daniel had almost dropped the phone. The idea that his choice to feed a stray cat could ripple outward to impact veterans across the entire country seemed too extraordinary to be real. But then again, everything about the past 18 months had seemed too extraordinary to be real. Prophet meowed softly as they drove through downtown Denver, past the 7-Eleven where everything had started. Daniel pulled into the parking lot and sat quietly for a moment, remembering the desperation, the hunger, the moment when he'd chosen compassion over survival. "You knew, didn't you?" he whispered to Prophet. "You knew that one choice would lead to all of this." Prophet's amber eyes held that familiar intelligence, that sense of ancient wisdom wrapped in orange fur. Daniel had stopped trying to understand exactly how Prophet's abilities worked. What mattered was that they worked, and that the miracles showed no signs of stopping. His phone buzzed with a text from Marcus Rodriguez. "Daniel, you're not going to believe this. It's a woman I'm marrying. Her father runs a nonprofit that helps homeless veterans in Phoenix. He wants to start a Prophet Foundation branch there. Says he's been praying for someone with exactly our model to contact him. 3 months ago, before he even knew we existed." Daniel smiled, adding Marcus's text to the growing collection of impossible synchronicities that seemed to follow everyone connected to the foundation. The pattern had become so consistent that Sarah Chen was writing a book about it, documenting case after case of people who committed to helping others and immediately began experiencing what she called miraculous life acceleration. But perhaps the most remarkable development was what happened to the people who tried to exploit the system. The foundation had encountered dozens of individuals who learned about the help others, receive abundance pattern, and attempted to game it for personal gain. Without exception, nothing positive happened for them. The universe, it seemed, could distinguish between authentic compassion and manipulative kindness with perfect accuracy. Prophet stretched and settled more comfortably in his seat, and Daniel realized that despite all the research and documentation and statistical analysis, the true miracle of the Prophet Foundation would always remain beautifully, mysteriously inexplicable. They had proven that kindness creates abundance, that compassion is contagious, and that choosing love over fear triggers cascades of positive change that benefit everyone involved. But they would never fully understand how or why it worked. They would just keep choosing love, keep helping others make the same choice, and keep witnessing miracles multiply in ways that transformed not just individual lives, but entire communities. As Daniel drove home to his modest apartment, he'd kept only enough of the inheritance to live simply and comfortably, Prophet purring beside him. He felt the same deep peace he'd experienced that frozen December night when he'd chosen to feed a stray cat with his last $3. The difference was that now he understood that moment hadn't been the end of his old life or the beginning of his new one. It had been the moment he'd learned to align with forces of love and abundance that had been waiting his entire life for him to remember who he really was. The Prophet Foundation now operates in 12 states and has documented over 3,000 miraculous transformations. Medical researchers, psychologists, and quantum physicists continue studying what they call the Morrison effect. But Daniel knows the real secret isn't something that can be measured or replicated in laboratory conditions. It's simpler and more profound than any scientific explanation. When you choose love over fear, especially when fear seems like the rational choice, you align yourself with forces in the universe that respond with generosity beyond imagination. Prophet passed away peacefully 18 months ago at the remarkable age of 24, nearly double the normal lifespan for cats. But his 3 offspring continue the work, and more remarkably, their offspring have inherited the same mysterious abilities. The Prophet bloodline now includes 17 cats working in veteran centers, homeless shelters, and therapy programs across the country, each one somehow capable of identifying people in genuine need and guiding them toward helpers. Daniel still lives modestly, still drives his Honda Civic, still shows up for work every day at the foundation. The difference is that now he understands his role, not as a philanthropist or social worker, but as someone who helps others remember what he learned on a freezing December night. That abundance isn't something you achieve through struggle and strategy, but something you align with through compassion and faith. Every person who walks through the Prophet Foundation doors learns the same lesson Daniel learned from an orange tabby cat named Prophet. That your willingness to help others when you can barely help yourself is the most powerful force for transformation in the universe. And that force, once activated, creates miracles that multiply far beyond anything you could plan or imagine. The last frame of security footage from that December night shows Daniel sharing his sleeping bag with Prophet outside the 7-Eleven, both of them choosing trust over fear in a moment that would change thousands of lives. It's a reminder that miracles aren't dramatic interventions from above, but quiet choices to love when logic demands otherwise. And those choices, Daniel has learned, are always rewarded in ways that transform not just your life, but the world around you. If Daniel Morrison's story proves anything, it's that the moment you choose compassion over self-preservation, you step into a version of reality where miracles aren't exceptions. They're the natural response to love in action. Maybe you don't have a mysterious orange cat leading you to your destiny, but you do have choices every single day to help others even when you're struggling yourself. To choose generosity when scarcity seems logical. To pick faith over fear when everything visible suggests fear is the smart choice. Daniel's transformation began with $3.17 and the decision to feed a hungry animal. Your transformation might begin with a smile to a stranger, a meal for someone in need, or simply the choice to believe that kindness creates abundance rather than depletes it. The universe is waiting to respond to your compassion with miracles you can't imagine. The only question is, what choice will you make today that opens the door for love to transform your reality? The Prophet Foundation continues to document new miracles every single day, proving that Daniel's story isn't unique. It's a blueprint available to anyone willing to choose love when it costs them something. Your miracle is waiting. It always has been.